Hey, it's Richard again, and I'm back to putting another modification on the ZR2 Bison project. Today, I've got a product that's coming from Timbren Industries. This is called an Active Offroad Bumpstop. Well, I'm going to talk about what that actually is, why you would need it, and go through a complete installation, followed by a little commentary on my experience using these products and installing them. So stay tuned for that at the end. It's something that has to do with why it didn't quite work out, but how I made it work. Before I get into the features and benefits and how it all works, I do want to clarify which particular system I'm using from Timbren. They have two offerings for the second generation Chevy Colorado and GMC Canyon. As you can see here, they have an active off-road bump stop with U-bolt flip kit, which is depicted with the green arrow. You can see there's more parts to that. And they have the standard active off-road bump stop kit, which is just a bump stop replacement. Now, looking at the picture here, you can kind of see what's going on. The U-bolt flip kit is, like the name implies, has the U-bolts going from the bottom of the axle up. This relocates all of the hardware above the leaf spring pack plate, which is the mount for the bump stop, so that it faces up and out of the way of the bottom of the axle. The active off-road bump stop kit that you see, which is just the replacement for the bump stops, mounts with the factory hardware, reuses the U-bolts, and just takes the place of the factory bump stop. So taking a look at what you get in the box, the kit is fairly complete. You get a couple of perches, two new leaf plates, two cups that hold those AON rubber active bump stops, and all the hardware you should need to install those plates together, and the U-bolts. Now, I did run into one problem, and that's something exclusive to the ZR2, which is not a problem with the base Colorados because there is a difference in the rear suspension. The thickness of the ZR2 leaf pack, as well as the block that's used to create the ZR2's additional height, actually are too thick to mount the U-bolt flip kit. When I looked at a little further, you'll see in this picture that if you install the entire U-bolt kit, you're going to find that the threads only go into the beginning three threads of the lock nut, not even protruding through the nylock. So it's definitely something that you will only have a problem with the ZR2. But you're going to see that I found some adequate U-bolts that are of a longer length that will work for this installation. If you notice the pictures you see here, these are of my truck at an earlier state, which is when I actually got the bump stops. Now, having installed them and figuring out that the U-bolts weren't long enough, I did call Timbren and talk to them about what to do. And at that time, this was obviously in the middle of COVID, so there's a ton of supply chain issues. They just recommended I got a larger U-bolt that could extend through and at least have some of the threads come through or engage the nut properly. So here, again, these are older pictures, and these will differ from the truck in its current state as I do the installation. As I was trying to source an adequate U-bolt, one of the things I noticed was that the supplied U-bolts are closer to an M12 or half-inch diameter U-bolt, and there's an ample amount of space in that plate. In trying to do something that's going to create a heavier duty product, I wanted to source a larger bolt. So I was looking for something that was an M14 or a 9/16, and actually I came across a friend who had the Timbren kit for a Tacoma, and Jason over at Rig Supply was able to pull that out of an old box as he was moving stuff around and give me a set of these as I was still waiting for my OME U-bolts, which are a little bit longer. But as you'll see in the end, these do work out, and these are actually a Timbren product for another application. So now that you've seen what comes in the box, before I get into the installation, I'm going to talk about why I'm doing it in the first place. So the Active Offroad Bumpstop is a unique bump stop in that it is a little larger, so you're going to see the overall height, and it's a little bit different design than the factory part. If you look at that factory part, you're going to find a very high durometer rubber, and it's going to be a very abrupt stop. And if you bottomed out the truck or had a lot of gear in it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's definitely something you can feel as well as hear. The Active Offroad Bump Stop provides you an earlier engagement. So with that bump stop being taller, it's going to start providing some of that ability to dampen earlier, which means we're going to slow down that axle as it's coming up and ready to hit that strike plate on the chassis. Anytime that we can do that, we're going to minimize the damage that might occur by the transfer of energy, but also it's going to create a much better ride. So let's get into that installation. Here's what I'm starting with. A stock ZR2 leaf pack with an add-a-leaf, that's the fourth spring down, and the big spring in the bottom is the overload. It does have a block at the bottom you'll see there, and these square style U-bolts that face down and have a leaf plate on the bottom. Here you're going to see that stock bump stop, which is a very hard rubber up on top, and that's what we're going to be replacing, and you can see that impacts this area up on the frame up top. I went ahead and assembled the Timbren rear unit, and this is for the flip kit, so make sure that we are talking about the same one. This has a pad that's going to go up on top, and this is made for the flip kit. So as you see on the bottom here, you've got the U-bolts facing down. In this kit, we're going to be installing the U-bolts, which are round and facing up. So we're going to get rid of this lower leaf plate, and when we replace the top piece up here, the U-bolts will be facing up with the nuts on top. This is what differentiates a flip kit from the standard Timbren offering. So I'm going to jump right into the installation now, and that first step is going to be removal of the factory components. The first thing we have to do is get the vehicle prepped with the proper jacking technique and jacking positions. So you'll see that the frame is suspended. I have two jack stands just forward of the leaf springs on the frame, and I have the jack underneath the axle housing with a little bit of force placed against the spring to make sure that the block, the leaf spring pack, and the actual position of the axle relative to that pin do not change while they release the tension on the U-bolts. As you can see, I finished up using the breaker bar to get the nut loose, and then I'm using my low torque impact to remove the rest of the nut and washer assemblies from the lower U-bolts. Once you do get it loose, you're going to find that that U-bolt falls free, and you can see the axle isn't moving relative to the spring, and you should be able to wiggle those up off the top. Moving on to the rear U-bolt, we're going to free up the last two nuts, the washers, and that lower leaf spring plate is going to be removed, and we're not going to reuse it. The Timbren flip kit will be putting the U-bolts in the opposite direction with a curved and half-round U-bolt versus the squared ones we see here. Taking a closer look at that lower leaf plate, you can see the little quarter round at the bottom so that it can engage the axle correctly. That piece is what allows these square U-bolts to be used. It can hold that leaf pack from the top down. Once you get that U-bolt removed, that completely frees up that bump stop, and we can pull it off, and as you can see here, it's a pretty simple device, and we're not going to reuse it, so we can set that aside and begin the installation of the Timbren parts down. So do as I say, not as I do. I am putting the plate with the assembled bump stop on the top. That was simply out of convenience because I already assembled it. Here you're going to watch me feed that U-bolt through the bottom, but you're going to see in a moment here when I put the washer and the nut on, there's just enough room for me to hand thread that nut over the top. But if I put a socket over the top to get the proper torque on it, that socket's going to bind and interfere with the perch of that rubber active bump stop. So here I'm just going to go ahead and finish up the hand threading of that, but then you're going to see me go back, and I'm going to use a 14mm to remove the two threaded bolts that hold the upper assembly with the perch and the active bump, which you can see now mounts to the upper leaf plate, which has been reversed with the flip kit. And now as I move on to the other U-bolt, you're going to see that I carefully insert that from the bottom up, and I'm just making sure that it doesn't pinch in any brake lines or ABS lines. There's two lines on either side that are right in this general vicinity. We want to make sure that you don't catch that as you're pushing the U-bolt up, as you will permanently damage that, potentially pinch it and have a brake failure. So bottom line is be careful and make sure that everything is passing through without any interference. With everything finger tight, here is what the assembly looks like from the bottom to the top and the final position for the bump stop. Before I can go on to torquing, I'm going to have to do a little bit of work here and unbolt that upper assembly so I can get the torque wrench up there with the proper size socket. Here's a quick look at what the plate looks like with the spring pack bolt sticking through, and now we're ready to go ahead and start doing our torquing. I'm going to use my light impact here to just drive the U-bolt through the nut to about the same position on each of them. Once I get them relatively close, I'm going to go ahead and switch off to my hand tools here so I can get the nice set and feel the pull of the U-bolt as it stretches to the axle. Once I'm comfortable with each of those bolts being to where they should be, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my torque wrench and apply the necessary torque. Now, as I mentioned before, I am using a different U-bolt, so the torque specifications will be different here than they were with the stock setup and with the Timbren smaller diameter U-bolts. So in this case here, just follow the instructions on whichever U-bolt you choose to use, and you'll be fine with the overall torque. The biggest thing about torquing here is making sure that you stretch the bolt equally on both sides. So here on each side, on the front and back, you'll see me pull a couple of times on each, find the appropriate torque level, and once I feel that, I'll go back to the opposite side. Once you do get the U-bolt set, you're going to find that if you go from one corner to the other, as it starts to pull the plate down and get to its final torque, you may feel that one side loosens up. This is completely normal, but one of the reasons why you do the pattern, and as well you repeat it multiple times until you get a nice torque set. We're in the home stretch now, and I just have to put this upper assembly, which is the perch, the cup, and the active bump, back on top of that assembly we just torqued down, and that's going to take those 14mm bolts and washers that I took off earlier. So this is really your final step here, and I'll show you what everything looks like. the upper assembly with the U-bolts installed all the way to the top of the nut. These are the larger U-bolts with the larger hardware assembly, so if you do opt for the bigger ones, this is what it looks like. Obviously, if you have a ZR2, the ones they provide you for the flip kit are not long enough, so if you opt for these or the OME versions, this is what your off-road active bump stops look like. So there's the installation, and now I owe you guys some commentary on my experience with the product and a few notes and suggestions I have. Ultimately, I have to say, first and foremost, Timbren makes a great product that works as advertised. The Active Offroad Bumpstop does what it's supposed to do, which is engage earlier, provide a more progressive spring rate as you near max travel, and still protects the vehicle from that metal-on-metal contact. Some of the side benefit is the side-to-side motion that you have is a little bit more controllable. You will find on the street that the stability added by the bump stop on either side in that earlier engagement does give you a feel of confidence as well. So that's something I wasn't necessarily expecting that I got anyways out of the product. So while the product does as it's supposed to, there were a few quirks in the process of the installation, and I did mention that there are a few issues with the U-bolt sizing. When you are looking at the standard Colorado and the Canyon, the suspension setup is a direct bolt-on. It's very similar to the dimensions offered in the kit's originator as a Tacoma part, but as you get into the ZR2 that has the block and a different spring pack, you're going to find that those threads just aren't long enough for that application. So that was a little disappointing to figure out that I had to kind of just make it happen. And buying the U-bolts was a little bit of a chore, hence the installation taking place months after I received the initial product. The other thing is that the U-bolts themselves that come in the kit, they are the same size of the factory U-bolt in diameter, but they just didn't feel like the same material. And unfortunately, I don't know what the exact material is, but even Timbren used a 9/16 or an M14 style U-bolt in the Tacoma, but somewhere, whether it's the process of COVID happening and some supply chain things, they've changed to a lock nut or a nylock style nut that's shorter and an overall shorter U-bolt. And that's just problematic with the necessity of the ZR2 to have that longer U-bolt. The biggest thing is I think I would reconsider my purchase, being that I would not buy the U-bolt flip kit and just stick with the straight bump stop replacement. And what I mean by that is that the U-bolt flip kit is really designed to try to increase ground clearance so you don't have that plate at the bottom. Now, if you know the Colorado and the Canyon, and especially the ZR2, they all suffer from the same thing, which is we have a shock that hangs well below even the bottom line of the pumpkin, meaning that the U-bolt flip kit really doesn't change our ground clearance all that much. So I would say save the money, buy the product, but just get the bump stop replacement, as that seems to do everything I need it to do, and probably you too.